Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar presentation for the Safety Planning and Seeking Safety Training for Behavioral Health Providers webinar series. A few announcements before we get started. Please make sure your sound is muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them in the chat or feel free to unmute if Avi or Jen opens up the floor. For those requesting a CE or certificate of completion, I will share an evaluation link in the chat towards the end of the presentation. In order to receive a certificate, you must attend the full presentation. Also, please note that you'll have 48 hours to complete the survey before the link becomes inactive. We will also be recording today's session. And if you do not want to be on camera or have your name shown, you may change your video options or name on the Zoom call. I will also be sending everyone a PDF of today's presentation after and the link to the CE survey. And then at the end of the week, I will be sending out this recording in case you would like to reference it at all. I will now hand it over to Avi. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. And just as a reminder, thanks to Alex for reminding all of us that this is one of the 6 trainings that Jen and I do weekly that is the only one that's being recorded. But if you type something into the chat, that's not part of the recording. And Jen and I, if we respond to it, we won't call out by name, we'll just read your question. So don't worry about your identity being revealed if you don't want to. The only people who see this are people who registered for the trainings but couldn't attend a session, so they wanted as a makeup. It's not disseminated widely. So we're going to continue our journey with seeking safety. And today what we're going to focus on is looking at situations and events that precipitate trauma or substance abuse. And in the old language, I'll put it that way, of the times, Lisa Najovitz talked about coping with triggers. So that permeates, and like we've talked about many times before, we don't want to reinforce the word trigger for all its concerns about associating with guns and triggers, suicidality, people who are suffering from domestic violence and being threatened by firearms, etc. So we'll talk about activating events, precipitating events, things that happen that provoke, that kind of thing. And then we'll talk about strategies to help people identify dangerous situations and relationships and how to set boundaries. So one of the big things of seeking safety is to avoid avoidable suffering and to be able to extricate yourself from risky and dangerous situations. And then the corollary to that is helping people develop interpersonal skills to develop good, supportive, safety and security and trust building relationships. So how to identify and nurture those relationships, how to make commitments to oneself and to others. And what we're hoping is that over the time that we next meet next week, you'll find ways to incorporate this in your daily practice. So as always, nothing to disclose. So the first number of slides is going to be a review for those of you who haven't been able to attend all of these, but also as a refresher. So this is our 3rd of 4 weekly sessions talking about seeking safety. And then, so we'll complete that journey next week. And then the following week, 2 weeks from now, we're going to pull together safety planning, which, like you know, is very much of most of the content of seeking safety, and connect it most clearly with safety planning, seeking safety, to provide sort of closure to these times that we've been together. So seeking safety, again, evidence-based for both initially for trauma and PTSD and co-occurring substance abuse, and it's been expanded to all kinds of mental challenges, dysfunction and disorders, co-occurring with substance abuse, misuse, dependence, and addiction. And again, a key part of it is no exposure to trauma, no narrating the trauma story, safety first, and primarily, that's what's emphasized. So clear clinical guidelines, the emphasis on commitment, and like we've talked about before, the commitment is not the typical one where the quote, patient, client, consumer makes a commitment primarily to us as providers, not even to themselves. This is more that they make a commitment to themselves, the rest of the group, if they're in a group session, and to us, but equally, we make a commitment to them. And we're very explicit about what we're doing on their behalf, again, to model how to understand people who you can trust, people who support your best self, your safe self, your aspirational self, as opposed to people who put you in dangerous situations and support your risky behavior. So commitment is a big part of that. And then encouraging understanding of the relationship. So a lot of seeking safety, especially initially, is sort of psychoeducational material about how does trauma manifest itself in your mind and body and spirit? What is the nature of the relationship between substance abuse and trauma? And it can go both ways. If substances disinhibit you and make it harder for you to set boundaries, to understand dangerous situations, it can put you in vulnerable situations where you are more likely to suffer trauma from people who want to harm you. And then certainly if you suffer from trauma and you experience it in your mind and body and spirit, then one seeming solution is to use substances to alter that state, that dysphoric state. But the problem is, again, that in a lot of ways, it exacerbates the re-experiencing, it exacerbates the anxiety and the panic and the social isolation and depression, and on it goes. And again, exposes you to more risk and greater harm. So this is the premise for why it's so important to treat both, much less to treat, like we've talked about, the whole person as opposed to treat isolated disorders, and to exemplify in our treatment that we're treating the whole person as opposed to there's the addictions therapist and there's the behavioral health provider and there is the crisis interventionist and there is the person who's a specialist in people who are at risk for suicidality and there's the person and the provider who helps you with medical problems. We want to have an individual or a team of providers that supports all the person to help them, first of all, identify with their personhood and their humanity, as opposed to signs, symptoms, syndromes, and disorders and dysfunction. We want to emphasize strength and capacity and competence, but we also want to address all parts because all parts interact with each other and not create artificial separations between the two. And like we've talked about too, that we don't want to create that in looking at triage and screening and intake and assessment, and then an assignment to somebody for crisis intervention if something intervenes before you see a therapist. And then if you see a therapist for a long time and you have a crisis, you get bounced back to the crisis person. Or if you're seeing a mental health provider, an addiction rears its head, then you get sent off to somebody else. We want to show that we treat everything in the same kind of fashion. It's all of a piece. And again, in this collaborative, co-creative, shared decision-making, person-centered approach that's culturally competent, and that we tailor our interventions and our responses to the unique aspects of that person, their strengths, their capacities, their competencies, their talents, their skills, their beliefs, their culture, their spirituality. So it emphasizes skill development and improved coping. And one of the mantras, again, of seeking safety in Lisa Najovitz is that no matter how awful the circumstances, it doesn't have to inevitably, permanently lead to addiction. There are other ways of coping. So the manual has the 25 topic areas, and like we've emphasized in the past, cognitive, behavioral, and interpersonal and case management domains. So one of the innovations is not just focusing on cognitions and behavior and emotions, but also looking at relationships, supportive relationships, risk inducing relationships, dangerous situations, dangerous relationships, and case management. Again, this is one of the first evidence-based practices in the early 2000s that emphasizes supported housing, supported employment, looking at nutritional insufficiency, looking at linking good medical care, parenting skills for parents, couples skills for couples, all of that. So here's the modules. We've talked about, last week we emphasized safety and detaching from emotional pain, grounding. And today we're going to talk about more in the kind of detail that we talked about last week. Again, the Judith Herman model, the three-stage model of recovery, safety, mourning, and reconnection. And like we've talked about many times, safety is the emphasis on seeking safety with the understanding that that builds the foundation for moving from a story of shame and humiliation to one of dignity and virtue. And then the reconnection with joy and productive activity. And like I've made the point before, in interpersonal therapy, Kriechman and Weissman, this is seen as a grief and a mourning and a bereavement for the loss of the idealized self, the self that you hoped that you would be if you hadn't been traumatized, abused, neglected, battered. So the safety stage is the initial process of this model, and the treatment stage that's emphasized in this model. One central idea: stay safe. And core principles are safety, ongoing priority. When Jen and I talk about this, we say safety probably every 10 seconds because it's the ongoing theme. And one of the nice things about this, one of the many things that Jen and I appreciate about this is whenever you see somebody and the time, you want to make the most effective use of the time. You might just have a one-shot deal where you're seeing somebody just for 20 or 30 minutes, so you want to give them the biggest bang for the buck. That maintaining a theme and maintaining a focus in therapy is absolutely critical. Seeking safety makes that really easy. Everything permeates from that. Focus on restoring ideals that have been lost. Again, notice the language. It's the assumption that people had ideals and values and purpose and meaning in life, and that they're rediscovering it, as opposed to they never had it, and they're vacuums looking to suck up all of your expertise and your biases and beliefs and values and ideas. And again, those 4 content areas I mentioned, and then the therapy process, which is like we talked about, the exact same thing as safety planning, which is building an alliance, compassion for their experience, emphasizing their agency more than ours, collaborative, co-created, brainstorming, looking at alternatives all the time, and that we are coaches, mentors, supports, not foundational people that they depend on. We're learning them to depend on themselves, on their own natural supports, on their strengths. So these are my words, but focusing on potential rather than pathology. There's an assumption with all this that change happens to everyone, that people are striving to be their best selves, that they've tried many ways to cope, and some of them have been successful in supporting their aspiration, and emphasis on practical solutions, breaking down solutions and problems into smaller parts with the assumption that one small step leads to another, and that change is an ongoing process. And then relating the materials, very present tense oriented, current, specific problems, and again, making the best use of time available. What makes it different? is not an exploration of the past and trauma, not a psychodynamic, psychoanalytically oriented kinds of therapy. So, as you know, the very first module is, what does safety mean to you? And we suggest some options, but we mainly look for what it means to different people at different times. And like we've done as a group together, people typed in the chat and we found out that it's very different for different folks. Safety is the most important priority, and there's a list of about 80 plus safe coping skills. These next two slides, like we've talked about in the past, are some highlights of that. And my suggestion is that you keep that as a poster, and whether you're seeing people as individuals or in group or a combination of the two, keep a running roster. And it's really nice as a sort of a therapeutic ritual to have people who came up with it write it on the list themselves, so that when they return to the office, they see that their contributions are something that you and all the other people who are in your office and that you work with treasure what they have to offer. And like we've talked about, even the most depleted people, even the people who are experiencing profound worthlessness, one of the major ways for them to be on the road to self-compassion and bolstering their self-esteem is to give whatever they feel that they have to others, to benefit others. It's really important. And volunteering is being one of the most successful ways that we can initially engage people. And like we know, a lot of people with lived experience become magnificent providers of care to people who share some of their concerns and their life experience. So the bottom line is always stay safe. And the recovery task common to both PTSD and substance use treatment is the psychoeducation, like we talked about. So the modules about PTSD and about substance abuse in seeking safety are essentially, like I said, psychoeducational, present time orientation, looking at the impact. And again, a lot of people experience in their body, some in their feelings, some in their thoughts, some in their relationships, some in their work life or their school life, looking at how it affects them and how they want to move to a place where they feel that their best self is being expressed. And dealing explicitly with urges and craving, a focus on self-care, again, emphasizing agency, all the things that you can depend on yourself to do, regardless of whether there are other people to support you. Just like safety planning, as you remember, the first step is for people to identify warning signs, to tell them that they're edging towards difficulties and may not respond to crises if they occur in the best possible way, because they're not sleeping well, they're not taking care of themselves, they're not nurturing good relationships, and they're actually seeking out dangerous ones. So emphasizing agency, responsibility, and self-compassion, really critical. And then attention to relapse prevention. As we know from the trans-theoretical theory of change, Chaskin DiClementi, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And maintenance is the hardest process of all, right? And that we understand that for any problem that we have, there's always going to be glitches. There's always going to be ways in which old problems recur and how to manage that. We don't have the expectation that anybody is ever cured of any kind of issue or problem. We're learning coping skills so that the next time it resurfaces, we can handle it better, feel more adaptive, more flexible, and that we're moving in the direction that we wish to move, as opposed to be pulled in a direction that we regret. So the safety stage goals, developing commitment to practice safety. It's a practice, almost like a spiritual practice of how to have self-compassion and safety. Mastering coping skills, safety planning, like we talked about sort of endlessly, learning when something is unsafe, learning when to involve other people, how to ask for help, which is what we'll be talking about this morning, utilizing the safety contract, especially how to respond to resurfacing self-harmful impulses, urges, cravings, even suicidal impulses. So safety skills, safety themes, grounding. And the therapy process we've talked about. Again, a refresher about the format, the check-in, the quotation, which emphasizes the theme that you and the individual or the group has settled upon as what they want to address. It may be setting boundaries. It may be pulling out of dangerous situations. It may be how to identify a healthy relationship. It may be dealing with cravings for substances. It may be how to take better care of themselves, how to advocate better for themselves. All those things are decided by the group, and then some kind of quotation. And it doesn't have to be all the quotations in the manual. The group can come up with whatever is meaningful to them. It could be a song lyric, it could be a poem, it could be a piece of music, it could be a quote from a spiritual practice, whatever it might be that moves them. And then looking at the topic, going over the handouts, making it meaningful to them, using the handouts not as explicit directions, but more as a focus for them to branch off into their own creativity, to find out what moves them, what pushes them in the direction that they want to go. They're pushed by themselves, not by us. And if none of the things that are discussed in the handout or the options that are done, our job is to help them look at their own creativity about what's worked, what hasn't worked. And I've mentioned this before, when they turn to you and say, well, I don't know, what do you think? One of the things I found really helpful is, well, who in your friends or your family, somebody that you've met, who you think has coped with a similar kind of situation in the way that you'd like to emulate, what would they suggest if they were here? Or when you handled something well, and you're not even clear about what was different, who could you ask to find out what was different? Or who said and gave you the support for it? Well, that's something that you would normally have a problem with, but you didn't, which is another solution-focused kind of question, which you could say, well, you're talking about how you had difficulty setting boundaries with that person. Was there a time when you had somebody, maybe the same person, or somebody like that, that you felt that you did a better job of that? What was different about that time? So instead of focusing on the times that are most awful, you focus on the times that are better. Not perfect, but better. And then they can say, well, I felt that I could talk it out, or I felt more assertive in myself, or I felt that I was in a place where I didn't feel physically at risk. We weren't at a bar, it wasn't late at night, we were outside in the park during the day, whatever it might be, that they can learn from how to adapt better. So we're always, part of, like we've talked about with seeking safety, is persist, persist, try again, as opposed to giving up too soon. And again, with people who are severely traumatized, they're embedded with a sense of being damaged, being soiled, having soiled identity, feeling victimized, feeling worthless, helpless, hopeless. So what we're trying to do is whatever sparks of empathy and compassion that they have for themselves, whatever parts that they feel that they can offer to themselves and to the world at large, we want to shine a spotlight on that and help them develop that. It's again, strength-based, solution-focused kind of work, not emphasizing pathology and dysfunction, again, emphasizing potential, capacity. And then the commitment to themselves and our commitments to them, their commitments to the other members of the group. And sometimes in a group, you might divide different tasks. Like let's say that people are interested in resources for shelter, for battered partners and or their children. You might ask, if the group seems motivated, that people all do the same task and then report to each other, so you make it a collective effort. And then the checkout is just like with safety planning, where the last thing that you talk about is the most important thing I learned today. is that this is my reason for living and moving forward. And seeking safety is the most important thing I learned today at the end of the session is this safe coping skill, or how to better achieve safety in this kind of situation. So you're, again, emphasizing what's important. Like anything else, whenever we do this, we always get feedback. We look for obstacles and barriers that might come up. They might be very practical, like not having transportation or funding. It may be that there's little capacity in the community to offer the services that are necessary. We have to look at that. But don't assume that everything's going to be fine. Then ask people, do you think you'll follow through? You've been sort of on board with sort of brainstorming and all this, but do you think you'll actually do this? And then you'll find out that maybe they're too ambitious for themselves and they're setting themselves up for failure. So you break it down into an easier part. So for instance, somebody might say, I want to go cold turkey for the week. Well, that might be way too much. So maybe you'll say, how about trying it maybe for a day, or maybe for part of a day, finding out, it's a harm reduction approach again, but making sure that whatever plan that they commit to is something that's doable, that relies mainly on their own resources. It's not that other agencies or other people or whatever have to change, or they have to suddenly become healthy physically or mentally for them to move on. The issue is finding something that they can do. Again, avoid avoidable suffering, work with what you have. Those are two sort of like mantras from seeking safety. So the big picture, reduce substance use, reduce PTSD symptoms, increase safety. So the check-in, the thing that Jen and I always like to emphasize as a reminder is you start with how are you feeling, but you quickly move to what good coping have you done? And like I've emphasized before, that's indirectly suggesting, which is a lot of therapies, Milton Erickson's strategic therapy, solution-focused therapy, narrative therapy. What you're implanting is when you say, what good coping have you done? You're saying not only that you do good coping at times, it's not always bad, you don't always fail, and you've done it in the past. It's nothing new to you. So you're always embedding in that good coping happens from you. It doesn't happen miraculously or sporadically or not at all. And you can do something about it. And when you've done it in the past, what worked and what would you like to tweak to make it work even better? And then you talk about unsafe behavior, commitment, and community resources. Again, we just reviewed this. And the checkout, like I just emphasized, name one thing you got out of today's session that promotes safety. So the core concepts: stay safe, respect yourself, use coping, not substances, to escape the pain. Now, embedded in that, just like with suicidality, we talked about this, that self-harm and suicidality is a coping skill and a way of coping. Unfortunately, it causes a lot of problems, but we, instead of viewing it as a pathological symptom of a disorder, we view it as an attempt to relieve suffering, just like substance abuse. So what we're trying to say is we understand why you're using substances. You're trying to cope with a difficult situation, but there are many, many alternatives other than addiction. Let's look at those. Make the present and the future better than the past. Learn to trust. It's an ongoing skill. And a lot of people come from environments and family situations, etc., where they never learned to trust. Nobody trusted anybody. So it's a skill that they have to develop bit by bit. And they have to know, just like we talked about, what does safety mean to you? Everybody's different. What does trust mean to you? Does it mean that people honor their commitments, keep their promises? Does it mean that they promote your security? Does it mean that they're great listeners and really take you in? Does it mean that it's real relational kinds of relationship with reciprocity and mutual commitment, or is it totally transactional? The only way that I relate to you is that I'm getting something back and forth. So just like we want to say, what does safety mean to you? What does trust mean to you? How do you learn to trust people? Getting help from safe people. So two things there. How to get help when you need it, but how to only get help from people that you can trust, who are safe, who promote your best self. Not people who will reject you, abandon you, criticize you, abuse you, traumatize you. If one method doesn't work, try something else. Never give up, what we talked about. And again, I asterisk that initially, Najavitz in her trainings would talk about, and then the manual, it's still there, to heal fully, become substance-free, but it's very much of a harm reduction approach. Again, 30 years ago, that was the common approach, sobriety only. We've talked about how to conduct the session, the checklist, case management strategies. And again, you're getting all the PDFs. So now we're going to move to looking at these modules today. Coping with triggers, and again, my asterisk to remind us to use a different word. Red and green flags, setting boundaries, getting others to support your recovery, healthy relationships, community resources. So first, we need to know how to ask for help. And I've emphasized this in the past. For a lot of people, when they're first exposed to seeking safety, this is something that they have a light bulb going on, providers especially, where we've assumed that people know how to ask for help, who to ask for help from, how to give an ask that you're likely to get good results from, as opposed to set yourself up for failure and further rejection. So this is an extraordinarily helpful module for people and topic for people to really understand. Just like Jen and I have talked about, grounding and centering is universally applicable. And I would say that everything in seeking safety doesn't just relate to trauma or severe mental issues, mental health issues, and addiction, but really all aspects of life, how to cope better. So I put in bold what I wanted to emphasize with you. Some people, now this is Najavitz's slide, so I'm using her words, but I wanted to bold it for you. Some patients have no one safe to ask help from. And that's something that I've mentioned to some of you. I can't remember for this group, but I've been doing this for over 40 years. And I remember that a decade or more ago, and decades ago, when I would ask people about who's your emergency contact person and who can you call on for support, people will come up like with 10 or 12 people. And lately, and I know this is true for all the people that I train and work with, who are a lot younger than me, that they'll say that a lot of people will say, I have absolutely no one. I have no one that can help. And I've had personal experience of that when people where I live or people who know of my work will call me at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, my husband just had a heart attack, what do I do? And then find out that I'm the emergency contact for them as opposed to anyone else, because they know no one else. Asking for help may be genuinely dangerous. So if you're asking for help from somebody who's perpetrating abuse against you, it's one of the worst things that you can do. So the goal is to identify safe people and then learn how to ask the questions. And we'll go into that in more detail. But the message is, you must get help from others to recover. No one can do it alone. And we know that a big part of all the kinds of treatments that are successful, especially for abuse, misuse, dependence, and addiction, rely on community of supports. People who support your harm reduction and your recovery, and steering away from people who, quote, support or embellish or accentuate your self-harm and your abuse. So there's two messages here. One is that you have a lot to offer yourself. And part of your compassion for yourself is not holding yourself to impossible standards and understanding that Most people, it's a cliche, but it's true. I've worked with terminally ill children for many, many years and their families. And what people always say when they're facing imminent death is that I wish that I had connected better to these people. They never say, I wish I was smarter, wealthier, I had more stuff. It's more that I really wish that I had expressed my gratitude to the people that I wanted to express, my gratitude for, surrounded myself with the people who bring me joy and connection and support my best aspirations, as opposed to people who I knew would criticize me, reject me, abandon me, much more, abuse me and traumatize me. So get help from others to recover, but get help from safe people, people that you can trust, people who empathize with you, people who build your capacity. So asking for help, start small. Practice on small people with very simple requests. So like I mentioned here, some very concrete things like a ride to a meeting, or being with you when you make a telephone call, or waiting in the waiting room when you're meeting somebody for the first time. Try to ask for help before a problem becomes overwhelming. Again, what does this sound like? Warning signs, right? You don't wait for a crisis to happen, right? And if you need to turn to other people, like in the safety planning, we practice first the skills that you can do on your own, then connecting to others for pleasure, for diversion, for distraction, for connection. Then you look to others, not professionals, for suggestions, guidance, help, maybe even supporting you in going to urgent care, the emergency room. You can ask for help at any time, before, during, or even after a hard time. Prepare how you'll handle it if the person refuses your request. And this is something that Jen and I do when we're seeing people individually for seeking safety. Again, we role play. So it's like, well, what do you think would happen if you asked Nicole to give you a ride? What do you think her response would be? And what would be the difference if maybe you talk to her when the group is ending about a ride for next week's group, if that's possible, or you called her at 4 o'clock in the morning when you were in tears? How do you think the response would be different? Learning to ask for help may feel awkward at first. In other words, for a lot of people, it's a new experience. If there's no one in your life you can ask for help, work on building a support network, people that you can trust. Okay. And that's yet another module in seeking safety, building healthy relationships, how to do that. When asking for help, be gentle and kind. No demands, no threats, no insults. And a lot of people don't have the model for that. Everybody around them, again, it's a transactional relationship, and the way they get what they want is by making demands or threats, or saying like, if you don't do this for me, you're dead to me, or you're a terrible person, or how could you possibly not want to help me in this kind of way? That's obviously putting others in a position where they feel that they don't see how you're being compassionate towards them, you're trusting in them, that you're enlisting them to support, even to give in to a demand like that, an angry demand, a manipulative kind of controlling kind of demand, doesn't support you in your best self. Carrying a list of numbers that you can call, and that's part of, like we know in safety planning, is who are those people that you can call to for guidance, for help, for advice, for support. So one of the important things about this, and you can do it with individuals and certainly within a group, is you can have people talk about what are the kinds of situations when they wanted to ask people for some kind of support or help, and it didn't go well. And then you can practice with each other's. And again, one of the things that Jen and I have emphasized throughout this is in a group, everybody has different strengths. So somebody knows how to phrase things well. Somebody knows how to suss out what kinds of things people will be more favorably responding to as far as an ask. So what I'd like you to do right now, if you're willing to, is if you could type in the chat what you think would be an easy ask and a hard ask to make of somebody that you're connected to. So if you could put like easy ask would be hard ask, difficult ask, meaning that it would be hard for you to get up the gumption to do in the first place, that you think you're likely to meet a bad response. Jen, maybe you could start us off. Think of an easy ask and a hard ask and type it in the chat to help people get an idea of what we're talking about. So we have an easy ask is give me a ride to the store. Give me a ride to the store. Easy, okay, great. Yeah, that's a pretty easy one. Other ideas for easy asks? Think about like let's say that you talked about a resource. Does anybody have the phone number or the web page or their address? How do I get there? Right? Do you know what hours they're open? It's just like a very simple kind of thing. A hard ask, stay with me overnight after surgery. Yep, that's asking a lot. Somebody drop everything that they're doing. Can I borrow your phone? Yeah, that might be a hard ask for a lot of people. That both for all sorts of reasons that I'm sure Clarissa was thinking that. What else would be a hard ask? Well, going back to suicidality, I know a lot of people who will call an acquaintance and say, I'm really feeling desperate. Can you call an ambulance for me? Or can you come over? Or I've cut myself, or I'm taking pills. Can you feed my pet when I go out of town and I live on the other side of town? Right. So it's inconvenient. It's not taking into account all the stuff for you. Great. Thank you. So you see that in a group, we could sort of banter back and forth about this. And we might have suggestions about like, and remember that idea of try to ask for help before things are overwhelming. So for instance, in the thing about feeding my pet when I go out of town, if you knew that you were going to go out of town 3 weeks in advance, you might look into who might be interested in that, wanting to do that. And you ask it in a very mild way and say, you know, don't worry about it. I'll look for a shelter, a place, you know, that I can, you know, put my pet, my dog, my cat, or I know a neighbor who's going to drop by, or maybe there's somebody that you might suggest who could drop by the home that I can pay them a little bit of money, whatever it might be. So you try it in small little stages, right? And then you learn that the important thing about this is not only to ask for help, but then when somebody responds and says, well, you know, it is sort of inconvenient to me. Have you thought about this person or that, right? I know, you know, there's a 16-year-old, he's looking for extra money. He's really reliable. He comes, you know, to take care of my dog once a day. It only costs a few bucks. Would that be okay for you? So you're learning that there's different ways to ask for help. And also one of the things that I'm alluding to is it's not binary. Do it this way that I asked for or nothing at all. One of the things, again, about building healthy relationships is compromise, feedback, interaction. So it might be that you're using the other person to sort of brainstorm, as opposed to saying, here's what I need from you, and I need it now. That's part of asking for help as well. Does that all make sense, folks? Any other ideas about asking for help? Okay, great. So now we're talking about moving to making and keeping commitments. Change occurs by making a plan to do something and then doing it, right? So preparation, action, no matter how one feels at the time. Okay? Substance abuse is by definition a series of broken promises to yourself in which a temptation to use in the moment overpowers the intent not to use, the ambivalence. So examine past experiences with commitments. You can see the always What we're focusing on is, what does safety mean to that person? What does trust mean to that person? What does making a commitment mean, right? Do these words evoke feelings, promise, responsibility? When you were growing up, what did you learn from people around you about commitments? So you may have learned, unfortunately, that no one keeps their commitments. No one even makes them. That's a whole different experience than certain people do and certain people don't. Or certain people make really huge commitments and honor them, but the majority of people make very simple commitments. And one of the things that's really helpful, where it engenders trust, is what I just sort of alluded to earlier. So if I'm asking April for a favor, and she said, you know, Avi, this is a little bit too much for me. It's just, I just don't have the time for it. Is there any small part of it that I could help with? That's a really helpful way to say, like, instead of writing April off because she didn't grant what I have, she's being really honest with me in a way that I can understand better about that my ask has many little asks in it, and that I can trust April both to be helpful in setting boundaries for herself and therefore for us. I can learn from that about not giving too much and not asking too much. And I can also learn better about how to ask things. So one of the things that we can also do individually or in group is when people say it didn't work out well, find out more. Because in that situation, if I just report it as, well, April didn't give me what I want, so I've written her off, instead of engaging in this little process, when she gave me the opening, she said, well, that's too much, but I'm willing to do something less than that, or think about another way that you can do that. That's a solution, right, to that issue that I didn't see, that I could explore further. So going into what does asking for help mean? What does commitment mean? What does keep making a promise mean? And, you know, make a promise that you can keep. So like we talked about for an easy ask, if I say, you know, unless something unusual happens, I'll be happy to give you a ride. That's very different than saying, you know, call me 24/7 for the rest of your life. And if you ever need a ride, I'm there, because that's unrealistic, right? So learning what a commitment means and how to do it is really important. There's a little worksheet. I promised you by when. So you always want to have some expectation of when this will be. To overcome my emotional blocks, I will. Again, barriers and obstacles. Figure that out. It is important for me to complete this commitment because it tells me that who I can rely on. It tells me who's part of my support network. It tells me that I'm not all alone, whatever it might be. So we want to emphasize how to deal with barriers and how it speaks to this larger journey towards safety and security and trust and self-compassion. If I complete it, I will reward myself with, and it could be like we've talked about before, some kind of soothing, some kind of joyful connection with someone. So again, what is a trigger? We don't have to go into that and why we use a different language. But here's some examples that Seeking Safety has. So a precipitant would be seeing a drug dealer, seeing ads for drugs, like for alcohol, thoughts like just one drink is okay, a time of day or season. PTSD symptoms can be precipitants for using drugs, like we've talked about. In PTSD, it could be subconscious, very elusive ways of cueing people to re-experience. Hearing a child cry reminds you of your own abuse. Anniversary of the trauma. A sudden startling sound, pain in your body. And again, I've known of a lot of people who unfortunately have suffered from sexual abuse early in childhood. And anyone who resembles that person's scent, or anyone who looks similar from the back, or their hair color, or their eye color, whatever it might be, or the way that they dressed, will cause them to re-experience things, and they might not even be aware of how subtle it might be. Substance abuse symptoms. So you can see that I've put in bold, again, that interaction between substance abuse and PTSD, one provokes the other. Change who you are with, what you are doing, and where you are. So learn to pull away from unsafe people who you're with. Learn to curb your urges and cravings for things that enhance your problems and diminish your capacity to recover. And then look at where you are. This is really important because a lot of physical situations are problematic and put people at risk. So for instance, a lot of people who have experienced a manic episode and have spending sprees and have very poor impulse control, say like, well, that's a car that I've always wanted to have, and the keys are in the ignition, nobody seems to be around. Not noticing that it's 2 o'clock in the morning, it's pitch black, it's in a dangerous area of town where there's been a lot of crime, and their impulse to get that car and to drive it puts them in a very, very risky situation. So reach out towards safe people, participate in activities that prevent self-destructive behavior. So as an example, don't just meet up with people who support your alcoholism in bars and say that you're only lively and engaging and interesting when you're drunk and incapacitated and intoxicated. Support people who like to go out in nature and hike, watching a fun movie, taking up a hobby, vacation, where placing yourself in healthy environments. Like if you feel urge or craving, go to an AA meeting rather than out to a bar with friends. Monitor the conversation. Some consumers will have difficulty identifying these kinds of precipitating events or activators. And here's one thing that comes from neurolinguistic programming. One of the ideas is when you're describing a situation, act as if you're a director and an editor of a movie. So you describe everything that happens in slow motion, and that gets people to focus on all the steps and the interactions that led up to the problematic event. So you can say like, you know, when I've been trying to quit smoking, excuse me, for years, and Jen just said, you know, I have a bunch of cigarettes and you want to hang out on the corner and do that, right? This crowd is just too difficult in this party. How about we smoke together? I have to learn that that is not the wisest thing for me, even though I think very highly of Jen. That's not something that I want to do. Help people understand that they are likely to feel bad when they're coping. They may feel anxious or deprived, you know, if they don't. I really wanted to smoke, and I was really happy she offered it to me, but there's a part of me that goes like, that's bad for you, all right? Especially if I have asthma, right? So it's important to know that in the moment, rejecting that offer that puts me in danger might feel bad. It might feel more anxious, but it's the wise self that I want to engage. People cannot arrange their lives to avoid all activators, right? So that's the idea of avoid avoidable suffering. Avoid avoidable suffering. And that's where red and green flags comes in. So the idea is being aware of when you're spiraling downwards into self-harm, into worthlessness, helplessness, and hopelessness, and when you're spiraling up, when you're building yourself up, when you have more effort in your recovery and you're not succumbing to relapse. Help people identify their own red flags and green flags to develop a safety plan. Warning signs, right? Signs that you're doing well. Red flags messages of distress and danger. Green flags, messages of safety and support. And here's a long list of them that are probably self-evident to you, but it's really helpful, again, both with individuals and with the groups, to say what it means to them, what speaks to them, right? So some people, a red flag is feeling stuck, right? Other people would be being irritable and argumentative and too easily violent. Some people, like it says here, would be canceling a treatment session when you know it's benefited you in the past because you feel you're unworthy of it, or you feel anxious about connecting to other people. And the safety plan is what I will do to stay safe in any of those situations, right? And we've talked about in safety planning itself, it's connecting to others, building support, looking at dealing with your urges and cravings, and concrete needs, case management needs, right? What I will do to stay safe, how I will avoid risk and danger. Setting boundaries in relationships, negotiating that sweet spot between too much closeness. So you let everything in, you're overly vulnerable, even with total strangers. And this happens a lot with people who have been abused significantly, is they tell everybody how much they suffered from danger, not knowing if that person will evoke even more risk for them, put them more at risk. Some people will see their vulnerability as tempting to them to abuse them further. And too much distance, again, being dichotomous, either you let everybody in without any sense of who's safe and unsafe, or you shut everybody out, including the people that you can trust. And where to say no, refusing drugs and alcohol, pressure to say more than you want to. And again, a big part of seeking safety is setting that boundary about, no, I'm not going to re-expose myself to trauma. No, I'm not going to overly identify as being a victim of trauma. And where you can say yes. Again, an easy yes. Joining a club, taking someone out for coffee, letting people get to know you in a safe, secure kind of way, bit by bit. When supports are anything but. A lot of information on that. So I'm going to end our talk today. There's a lot more information in this about healthy relationships and support in the handouts. I think a lot of them are sort of self-explanatory to you, but they might not resonate with people's experience that you see. So it's really important, like always, to find out, what does support mean to them? What does a healthy relationship look like? How can they discover that and rediscover that in their own lives? And so I'm going to leave it to, I think Alex has already probably typed in the chat. There you are for the link for your CEs. And we'll pick up this next week and then talk about other aspects of seeking safety. And we're very much looking forward to it. Thanks for joining me and Jen, and hope to see all of you next week.